It's great to be joined by attorney Mike Papantonio, co-host of Ring of Fire Radio, and also the host of America's Lawyer on RT, which premiered last night. For people who don't know the concept here, Pap, because it's a really different concept for a program, what is it that people will see on the show?
Well, there's so many stories that corporate media, their advertisers will not, they order them, don't tell these stories, basically. If it's a pharmaceutical that's killing people, and Pfizer's one of their advertisers, or Merck is one of the advertisers, say NBC, CBS, ABC, basically they get the order, don't tell the story if it's going to hurt sales. So you really can't tell stories that matter to consumers. If it's Wall Street who's stealing from mom and pop investors, it's tough to tell that story because Goldman Sachs and Morgan, all of the big folks on Wall Street are advertising through corporate media. Same way with environmental cases. If DuPont, for example, is destroying an entire ecosystem, you really can't tell that story if you're on corporate media because the advertisers won't let you. And I've had first-hand experience with that. I mean, where I was told, we tried to tell a story about something called yellow wood, that we were talking about the fact that it contained arsenic, and we were shut down immediately on MSNBC.
Yeah, talk about that, because you were at the time a fairly regular guest on MSNBC, weren't you? And then you went on and you started telling the story, and all of a sudden, was it a year or more that you just did not get invited back?
I think it might have been a couple of years, yeah. But then I was doing, in between there, I was doing Fox News during the time I was a liberal on Fox. Yeah, but I told the story about something that was called yellow wood, and it was where they were using this wood that we alleged and I think showed clearly had content of arsenic in it. But unfortunately, they were using the wood for children's playgrounds. And that kind of wood is fine if you're building a foundation for a house that, you don't want the wood to rot, or if you're building a pier that reaches out into a waterway. That's good. It actually works for that. But the point is, you don't use that for children's playgrounds. And so we did a segment, Joe Scarborough and I did a segment, and the next day I got a call from Phil Griffin, who's I didn't. Joe got the call from Phil Griffin saying, what's up here? And it was almost as if we had to go back on and do a recant the story, which I refused to do. And so that's pretty typical of what you run into with corporate media. It's all about money. They have no responsibility to really telling investigative stories. I mean, just look at the tobacco problem, where you had 60 Minutes that even hedged on telling the story about tobacco and the dangers of how it causes cancer. And that's even after the CEOs for 12 different companies raised their right hand and committed perjury in front of Congress, lied to Congress about the dangers. But still, you cannot get corporate media to tell these stories anymore.
Oftentimes when you tell somebody about a legal show, they imagine, a panel of 4 people yelling about whether someone is guilty or not guilty of some depraved crime against kids or something like that. America's Lawyer is a totally different type of legal show. I mean, you're talking about specific corporations, and you're talking about some of the cases that attorneys are involved in. Can you give us a couple of examples of what we can expect?
For example, the first show we talked about Johnson & Johnson's talc powder, where we actually showed the documents that came from their file cabinets that showed that they absolutely knew of the dangers of ovarian cancer relating to talc powder. So we don't just, I begin the show, David, with a short opening statement, about 6 or 7 minutes, but in there I'm actually showing the documents that I'm relying on. I'm not asking anybody to take my word for anything. We actually show them the documents, and then we move right into the lawyer who might be handling it, and they talk more about the documents and what's showing up in court. So we started off with that case. We started off with Aaron Brockovich on the Flint, Michigan cover-up. And we focused on the idea that you had Rick Snyder up there that was covering up the dangers of this water that children were drinking by the gallons for a year. and the amount of lead that was contained in it, why it was covered up, how it was covered up. And Aaron Brockovich handled that issue. So it's kind of gloves. It's totally gloves off, David. There's nothing warm and fuzzy about what we do. We go after the other side, and then we end the show talking about the good, the positive stories that are out there where there's been great developments in the law on behalf of consumers. And again, consumers simply don't have the chance to hear those stories either.
How is your legal community, given the types of cases that you work on and try, preparing for the incoming Trump administration? And by that, I mean, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which both Donald Trump and incoming Secretary of Energy Rick Perry have financial connections to. Scott Pruitt at the EPA, a guy charged with environmental protection who has a multi-decade record of doing the exact opposite. I mean, do you think that there are implications in terms of the work that you do from the incoming cabinet?
Well, it's just going to create a lot of work. I mean, we've been through this before. For example, after the Bush administration, we started seeing more pharmaceutical cases where dangerous drugs were killing people literally by the thousands, whether it was a birth control pill that was causing blood clots, or excuse me, that was causing strokes in women, whether it was an anticoagulant drug that was supposed to be used to avoid blood clots, that was causing death in people by just bleeding out. So we saw a lot of that come out of the Bush administration, and oddly enough, Clinton as well, because there was such an effort to deregulate. The FDA was basically neutered in their ability to be able to do anything, and they voluntarily participated with the pharmaceutical industry because they were getting jobs. You see, FDA would get a job, they would move through the process, and they would say, yeah, we're going to allow this drug to go on the market. Next thing you know, that person is working with the drug company. So we're going to see the same thing, and it's going to be the younger lawyers of 5, 6, 7 years from now that have to clean up this mess again. In the meantime, we're going to go to court every time we have to slow everything down as much as possible.
As far as America's Lawyer is concerned, any time that there's a program that starts, a savvy media consumer would say, okay, well, let's explore what conflicts of interest could arise based on the advertisers on that program. That's going to be very specifically not an issue with America's Lawyer, isn't it?
No, that's one reason, obviously, I agreed to do this. I mean, there is no conflict of interest at all. I mean, we're not, obviously some of the cases that we're talking about, we're going to be involved with because we've been doing this for 35 years. And we will have tried some of those cases, but you don't have to take our word for it. We'll have people besides me talking about the case. And as far as advertising, they don't really advertise. They have the same advantage that BBC had, or where they're able to tell a story without having an advertiser make a telephone call saying you have to take that story down because it's going to affect sales. It's really odd. Right now, you're in the midst of, you've got the Democrats primarily beating on Russia for hacking. At this point, I think you'd conclude the same thing I have. There's all this innuendo, anonymous this, anonymous that. So far, I've seen no proof of anything. But nevertheless, it's a good talking point for the Democrats who feel like they have to blame the failure of the election on the FBI, Comey, on Bernie Sanders, on WikiLeaks, on Russians, on progressive media, on misogynists, on millennials, on fake news. I mean, we've seen it all. And
yeah,
so,
I think I think I agree with you in terms of, there's plenty of blame here that should be inward looking. At the same time, I've disagreed with the right-wing idea that, hey, the CIA was wrong on Iraq and we can't trust them now either on this Russia thing, because it's sort of a false notion that the Bush administration misused what the CIA had actually said. So that talking point specifically, I think, is one that's being really misused by the right to discredit the CIA unfairly. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, my response is the CIA is not a moot bunch of morons. I mean, they had the right to speak up. They didn't speak up, even after Powell and Rice showed up in front of the UN with this fraud game that they played about yellow cake uranium. They knew the lie.
Yeah.
And they chose to keep their mouths shut, and thousands, tens and tens of thousands of people died because of it. I have very little respect for the CIA, very little. And I'm not equating this with it, but you know, it's just not people like me that are doubting the CIA. It's the FBI doubting the CIA. It's an organization that runs all of the security entities that say we're not buying into this Russian hacking. So we have to see more. I mean, I think it makes me angry. The anger is to see the Democrats using this as some type of prop as far as why Hillary failed. It's incensing to me.
Yep, I agree with you. I mean, the bottom line is, even if all of the allegations are true, if you didn't have such a candidate with this level of baggage, 58,000 votes in 3 states would not have swung the election to begin with. That's sort of where I end up on it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Not only that, but it's kind of a misdirection, David. We see it in court all the time where the defense lawyer, we present these horrible documents, and the defense to the case is, well, yeah, these documents are bad, but let's talk about where Papantonio got those documents, as if that matters. You see, the emails were horrible. And so rather than addressing that, they want to blame it on somebody else. And to me, it's just insane. And unfortunately, rank and file Democrats are buying into it, and it's making them look foolish.
America's Lawyer premiered on RT last night. We've been speaking with the show's host, attorney Mike Papantonio. Always great to talk to you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.